Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to the third of our double shot election interviews where we speak to the finance spokespeople for the major parties, or the ones at least in Parliament, and ask them why should people who are regular readers of Interest vote for them, particularly around the areas of interest rates, housing, banking, that sort of thing. And today with us at interest.co we have Russel Norman, who's the co-leader of the Greens, and particularly focused on economic issues. Russell, welcome to interest.co.
Thanks, Bernard.
Good. We always start with a free kick with these. Why should we vote for Green?
Well, the Greens platform is cleaner, fairer, smarter at this election. So cleaner rivers and also beaches. Fairer society, dealing with the poverty and inequality, and a smarter economy. And so that's all about smart green innovation. It's a common narrative, we're well familiar with it. New Zealand economy has been heading down a track which is, simple commodities into a few markets, low value add, low productivity growth. We want to increase the amount spent on research and development and innovation. And the reason why that's particularly green is that it means that you can build industries like the ICT sector, which has a pretty low environmental footprint, but has high value add, high wages, and can survive a long distance from our markets because it has gravity-free exports. So, that's the kind of frame that we were operating in.
On that value add thing, what's your monetary policy?
Well, on monetary policy, basically it's about extending the targets of the Reserve Bank, so it doesn't just look at inflation, but does more what most central banks do around the world, which is look at either a measure of output or external imbalances, whichever way you want to look at it, because obviously external imbalances is the big problem in the New Zealand economy, consistent problem with current account deficits. Also, we think the decision maker should be the board, not the governor, and the board then can represent the broader productive sector. So we think that would help give a broader perspective on monetary policy from the Reserve Bank itself.
Would it still have an inflation target?
We think yes, have a dual target, which is pretty standard. I mean, even when other central banks were supposedly focused on inflation, in reality they had dual targets because they're also focused on output. So we'd say have a target. Inflation's important, but you also need to look at the external imbalances.
So central banks overseas have been printing money. You've said some things about printing money. What's your current view on printing money?
So I got myself into some, some hot water on this. So by suggesting New Zealand should do quantitative easing like everyone else, clearly there isn't the political support for that. So we backed away from that. That's just the reality of it.
What would happen though if we saw inflation come off and head towards deflation? What would your view be then?
Well, obviously if you started heading towards zero or even potentially negative inflation, then central banks, I think, would probably change their perspective. Even possibly our central bank would change its perspective and adopt slightly more unorthodox approaches. But that would be an issue for the central bank.
Capital gains tax, big topic in this election. What's the Greens version of the capital gains tax that you would like?
So we've, supported capital gains for many years, and the reasons being equity. Why should one form of income be taxed, like wages, but capital gains aren't taxed? Doesn't make any sense. And for reasons of broadening the tax base. So even if you only get 5% of your tax income from capital gains, it does have a broadening effect. And then the third reason is around trying to influence investment decisions and move a little bit out of investment property. I mean, you're not going to have a massive change, but some change. And so we'd say exclude the family home, on realisation, New Zealand assets, and then we'd kick it to an expert panel to work out the details. I think it's worth noting though, that we currently have a form of capital gains in New Zealand, but it's a highly subjective one. So it's like, what was in your mind when you bought that piece of land? Did you intend to sell it for profit? And I just think that's bad tax law. I can't believe Bill English defends this. So, he says, we have capital gains in New Zealand, but it's like, well, it's all about whether the tax commissioner can establish that in your mind, your intent was to profit from the gain, which is just arbitrary.
But they've spent quite a bit of money employing people at IRD to look into your mind and work out what you're up to.
Well, why don't we have an objective test which says if you make capital gain out of it, you pay tax? Wouldn't that be better? Simpler? It's more straightforward?
And the green version of the capital gains tax is at the marginal rate rather than 15%. What's your view there?
Yeah, we've kind of said that we'd look at that. I mean, basically what we've said is, look, we've got our own kind of preferences, but the key thing that I think the parties need to do is set out the general direction and then kick it to a working group to sort out the detail. Because, there's so many options on the table as to how you lay out a capital gains tax.
So you're saying not necessarily at the marginal rate?
Not necessarily, but we'd look at it. It's one of the things we put on the table.
We have a lot of viewers who are KiwiSavers. What's different about the green policy on KiwiSaver?
It's not radically different, to be honest, to the government. I mean, so we support opt-in, compulsory opt-in, but still give people the option of opting out. So we don't support Labor's, fully compulsory scheme. The reason being that sometimes it's not the best thing for people to do with their savings. The other part of it that we'd put into the mix would be a public option on KiwiSaver, which is essentially saying, just in order to make sure there's good competition in the providers, because, fees can get out of control, is you'd use the super fund as the kind of back room of a KiwiSaver operator, so the money ends up there and they manage it, which was just low transaction costs, and then you stick a front end on it, whether through KiwiBank or IRD, which has a kind of low transaction front end on it. And so you go, we want to try to put basically a black and white brand, generic brand cheap version of KiwiSaver in there, using the existing investment infrastructure of the super fund to try to keep the price down.
Is it appropriate to use this super fund to do that, given that it's got a very long-term investment horizon? It's not really used to money coming in and coming out, in the way that it does with KiwiSaver.
Well, I mean, they've got to manage the stocks of their capital anyway, so it would mean that there would be this money coming in. We don't know the volumes. It would depend how many people chose it. And for a lot of people going into KiwiSaver, actually having a long-term perspective, particularly if you're a young person, is not a bad idea. So it would be particularly suited to a young person coming in who was open to a relatively aggressive strategy, which, the super fund takes pretty long-term kind of horizon, which it should. So there's a real role for it there, I think.
And the business of withdrawing from your KiwiSaver to put a deposit on a house, what's the green policy on that? Given that National have got this plan to double subsidies for first home buyers, particularly for those buying new houses.
We haven't supported changing the rules, so basically we've been pretty conservative about it, I guess, and supported the status quo.
Now, looking at income tax, you've got some proposals for change. What are they?
So the climate tax cut says you put a price on carbon and then you use the revenue from that to have the first $2,000 of income tax tax-free. So 0 to 2,000 at zero rate, right? And then over 140k, run it at 40% for every dollar over 140,000 of income. So what we're trying to do is use the climate tax cut to put a price on carbon, drive down emissions. OECD says that's the most efficient way to reduce emissions, and then recycle the revenue in the form of tax cuts, but also reducing the company rate from 28 to 27%. And then at the other end of it, we're saying actually, in order to fund a big poverty alleviation scheme, which is one of our policies, we're asking the top 3% who earn more than 140k that they pay an extra 7 cents in the dollar for every dollar over 140k.
But a lot of the money you're raising is actually by lifting the trust rate to that 40% as well.
Yeah, we kind of had to match it, otherwise you just would have opened up an avoidance can of worms.
Now, looking at foreign buying, this has again been a topic. What's the green view on what should be not allowed to be bought by non-residents?
Well, I mean, with regard to farmland, I put a bill up to Parliament, which got pretty close to getting the numbers actually, which basically matched the existing definition of sensitive land in the Overseas Investment Act, which is generally for farmland over 5 hectares. There's a few other categories. And we've said we just basically prohibit that from going into foreign ownership. We think not making any more food producing land with access to water, incredibly valuable thing. Why would you let it go offshore in terms of its ownership? And obviously the Chinese government has a very clear strategy about acquiring vertical integration of food back into China. Makes sense for them, perfectly rational and not an unreasonable thing for them to want to do, but pretty stupid of us to let them do it. And then with regard to the urban, we'd place some kind of constraints, particularly on standalone housing with land on foreign buyers. So, whether you look at Vancouver, Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland, Hong Kong, Singapore, everyone's got the same issue, which is there's big element of offshore buying into the housing market in all of those cities, and a lot of them have introduced constraints to try to take some of the heat out of the demand side.
So would you have Australian-style rules where foreign investors could buy off the plan or, apartment-style things, but not land and house existing packages?
That's one option. So we'd look at that option. The other option is the Hong Kong option, which is like a bit of sand in the wheels, 15% surcharge on offshore buyers. So there's a number of tools on the table for how you deal with the huge surge in offshore demand for housing. It's a problem everywhere. I mean, it's not a uniquely New Zealand problem.
But there isn't a set green view on whether you do the 15% or whether you have the Australian style.
No, I mean, we're just focused on making sure you deal with some of that demand side, which is driving up prices. Exactly how much, we don't exactly know because of the lack of stats on it.
The other big issue is housing. So Labor have this idea of 100,000 houses in 10 years. The government says it's doing some things on housing supply. What's the green view on how to change the housing and affordability equation?
We've got a fair bit of sympathy with Labor's approach. Probably the big difference for us is that we'd focus more on densification, particularly in Auckland. I mean, putting other things aside. I know it's been highly controversial, of course, but it seems to me that if we're going to have the kind of great city that we need Auckland to be, we need Auckland to be our great international city. It needs an absolutely kick-ass public transport system, the City Rail Link, and so much more. And we've put a plan out for that. But it also needs to increase densities. And we know that there's a lot of opportunity to do that within the existing footprint of Auckland, rather than National's approach, which is endless sprawl. Sprawl is incredibly expensive and inefficient.
But public transport and rail can be expensive. Would the rest of New Zealand be paying for this kick-ass transport system in Auckland?
Well, what we did is we put out our National Land Transport Fund 10-year projections. So we took the government's and then we turned it into our own, so we changed the categories. And basically we moved significant amounts of money out of new motorways and into public transport. And that's we've laid out how we're going to pay for it. And then that means you can afford to build some pretty impressive public transport networks and also invest in the National Rail Network if you're willing to make that decision. So, at the end of the day, you've got to decide where you want to spend the money, and so we've actually laid it out. Only the National Party and the Green Party have laid out where they would spend the money in terms of the National Land Transport Fund, and they're two very different kind of world views, because National, it's $14 billion into new motorways. The Greens take essentially only $3 billion into new motorways and use the other 10, 11 billion for public transport.
Dairying is a big issue for the economy, and a lot of our readers are farmers or interested in dairying. What's the green view on particularly use of water and on swimmable rivers?
Well, one of our priorities is swimmable rivers. So we're saying, the standard across the country, minimum standard should be swimmability, and that should be the target that we're aiming for. Obviously, in a lot of rivers, it's going to be quite a long way to go to get there. But National's approach, which is wadeability with a 1 in 20 chance of getting seriously sick if you just touch a river, is to, aim for a target down here. We think we should be aiming for a target up here. Over time, the effect of that on the dairy sector is to place an environmental limit. I mean, it basically says you can't just, the volume-based strategy will reach environmental limits, already has in many, many catchments across the country. And so I think that does exactly what the dairy sector needs to do, and which it says itself it wants to do, which is move away from the volume-add strategy towards the value-add strategy. Once you put in place environmental limits, which a Clean Rivers rule effectively is, then it says to the dairy sector, if you want to maximise profits, the path of going down the last drop of milk off the last blade of grass, that path is reaching its limits. And if you want to increase your profits, you're going to have to look elsewhere, which is exactly what we need to do.
But isn't it going to cost billions to have swimmable rivers, particularly around cities and towns?
Well, cities and towns is obviously one part of the equation, because we know that urban waterways have, significant pollutants in them. But in terms of the scale, it's pastoral catchments are, by far, most catchments that are polluted are pastoral catchments. Not to say urban catchments aren't polluted, they are. But it's a matter of saying what's your target and what's the path we're going down. Because currently, basically the central government target says you can keep polluting because we're going down there. Whereas we're saying, no, you can't keep polluting, we've got to improve practice. And that's both in urban and rural.
So how would you implement that? Would you use the national policy statement and the RMA rules to do that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, basically the legislative architecture is there. I mean, there was a proper national policy statement on freshwater management which came back from the Board of Inquiry that was headed up by former Principal Environment Court Judge David Shepherd. National Party took that proposed national policy statement on freshwater management and gutted it and turned it into the ridiculous thing we've got now. The architecture's there if you've got a government that has the political will.
And just finally on water charges, people in the dairy industry say, and the irrigation industry say, the green plan for unspecified water charges could be expensive. What's the view there?
Well, I mean, OECD, Treasury, the kind of natural resources sector in the New Zealand government, Ministry for the Environment, they have all come out in favour of some kind of charge on commercial use of water in relation to irrigation in particular. And the reason for that is to drive efficiencies. That prices work. I believe in markets, prices work. And so that's why there's, price on carbon, that's why price on water, And so what we said is, look, we'd use all the revenue raised to invest in cleaning up rivers and lakes, which is in the long-term interest of the New Zealand agri-food sector. Our brand, Clean, Green and Safe, relies on good environmental performance, and we don't have that at the moment. So any revenue raised would go back into the sector effectively to protect their long-term interest, which is what clean rivers are.
What would the price be, and how much would you raise?
We'd negotiate it with them. That's the thing. Last time we kind of nominated a particular price. This time we said, okay, well, you guys have got a problem. You're saying you've got a problem with the price. Well, we'll talk to you post-election about what you think is the right price, because there has to be something. And remember, we've already got the National Environmental Standard on measuring irrigation takes, so we have the mechanisms already in place in order to implement it, because we're now measuring water takes. And so the next step is what the price should be, and we'll talk to the sector about what that should be, because it doesn't have to start large. It's more a direction of travel. It's saying, look, this is where we're going to go with this thing, and we want to drive efficiencies. Water's incredibly valuable in the world right now.
Russell Norman, the co-leader of the Green Party, there with the third of our election double shots on interest.co.nz. Thank you very much, Russell, for coming into interest.co. I'm Bernard Hickey for interest.co.